Religions call sex sacred, yet they have whipped, stoned, and even killed people for it. They tell you it is a divine gift, yet also a dangerous temptation that can ruin your soul. Why would something so natural be treated as something so feared? The answer begins thousands of years ago, long before holy books or formal doctrines existed, when power, control, and fear shaped morality. By the end, you will see why this fear isn't really about sex at all. Long before the world's major religions took shape, ancient civilizations were already weaving sexual control into their legal codes and cultural norms. In Mesopotamia, for example, the Code of Hammurabi did not just regulate trade or property. It dictated the boundaries of sexual behavior, especially for women. Adultery by a wife was not merely frowned upon. It was a crime punishable by death, often by drowning. Meanwhile, a husband's infidelity was usually overlooked or treated as a minor offense, revealing an imbalance of moral expectation that would echo through history. Egyptian society told a slightly different story. While less fixated on sexual prohibition than Mesopotamia, the ruling elite still tied sexual morality to the preservation of social order. Marriage, inheritance, and legitimacy were the cornerstones, and anything that threatened them was swiftly condemned. Sex was not just personal, it was political. Hebrew law, emerging from the ancient Near East, inherited and adapted many of these ideas. In Deuteronomy and Leviticus, sexuality was closely tied to purity, community stability, and divine favor. Sexual misconduct was not just a private matter. It was framed as an offense against God Himself. And here lies an early, ugly truth. Women accused of adultery could be stoned to death, even on the basis of witness testimony alone, while male offenders often faced lesser consequences or found loopholes through polygamy and concubinage. These laws were not abstract, they were enforced, creating a climate where fear of punishment was a stronger deterrent than moral conviction. Across these early civilizations, one pattern emerges. Control over sex meant control over inheritance, lineage, and ultimately power. It was not only about piety or purity, it was about keeping social structures intact, ensuring property stayed in the right hands, and preserving patriarchal dominance. This blueprint of control would be refined and enforced even more strictly once organized religion solidified its authority. As the Abrahamic religions emerged, the control of sexuality reached new levels of authority and permanence. What had once been cultural custom or civil law was now declared the will of God. This shift made questioning these rules far more dangerous, because to defy them was not simply to break the law, it was to defy the Creator Himself. In Christianity, early church fathers like Augustine shaped sexual morality into something deeply restrictive. The ideal was chastity, even within marriage. Sex was tolerated only for reproduction, and pleasure was often seen as sinful. Celibacy was elevated as a spiritual ideal, creating a hierarchy where the pure, abstinent life was considered closer to God than the life of a married couple. Sexual desire itself was reframed as a temptation of the flesh that needed to be constantly suppressed. In Islam, the Quran and Hadith offer detailed regulations on sexual conduct, framing them as divine decrees. Adultery or zina was condemned with extraordinary severity. Here lies the ugly truth. In some historical Islamic legal systems, those found guilty of adultery could be executed by stoning, a method chosen for its slow and public brutality. For unmarried offenders, flogging, often 100 lashes, was prescribed. These punishments were not only physical but symbolic, meant to serve as public spectacles of deterrence, and they targeted women disproportionately, especially when the burden of proof often relied on witness testimony that was easier to produce against them. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam shared more than just a belief in one God. They shared a suspicion of sexual freedom, seeing it as a threat to the moral and social order. The Abrahamic approach fused divine authority with legal enforcement, creating systems where sex was tightly bound by marriage. Gender roles were rigidly enforced, and deviations were met with harsh consequences. In each case, control over sexuality was not only about morality or faith, it was about preserving the structure of power itself. By this stage in history, sexuality was no longer merely regulated. It was sanctified as a matter of eternal consequence, and the rules were now guarded by both earthly courts and the fear of divine judgment. This combination would ensure their survival for centuries to come, shaping cultures and laws long after the original scriptures were written. Physical punishments may have been the most visible tool, but the most enduring weapon of all was psychological conditioning. From an early age, followers were taught that sexual desire was inherently dangerous, a temptation that could lead them away from God. This idea seeped into prayers, sermons, and daily life, making sexuality something to be watched, feared, and controlled from within. Shame became a silent prison. In Christian teachings, the concept of original sin was linked to the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, often portrayed through the lens of sexual temptation. This association made human sexuality seem tainted from the very beginning, creating generations of believers who saw their own desires as evidence of moral weakness. In Islam, modesty laws such as the hijab or stricter seclusion practices were framed as protection and honor, but they also reinforced the idea that a woman's sexuality was a dangerous force that needed to be hidden from public view. Men, in turn, were warned that even looking upon a woman with desire could lead to moral corruption, making sexual attraction a constant source of inner conflict. Judaism too carried forward rules of ritual purity that connected sexual activity with spiritual cleanliness. Certain periods after childbirth or menstruation were marked as times when sexual relations were forbidden, and violations of these rules were not simply acts of disobedience. They were framed as breaches in the covenant with God. This embedded the idea that even natural bodily functions could carry spiritual danger. The most effective part of this psychological control was that it required no constant policing. Once the fear of divine judgment was internalized, people began to police themselves, censoring their thoughts, avoiding certain behaviors, and even feeling guilt for dreams or fleeting fantasies. This self-surveillance meant the system could persist with minimal external enforcement, ensuring that the chains remained even when no one was visibly holding them. Even in modern times, extreme sexual policing continues across the globe. Evangelical purity culture in the United States teaches young people to see natural desire as sinful. Abstinence programs use public pledges, behavioral policing, and guilt-inducing ceremonies to instill fear. Young men and women experience anxiety, shame, and distorted views of intimacy that can last decades. In contemporary Islamic contexts, punishments still range from social exile to brutal physical violence. In some families, daughters who have sex before marriage face honor crimes, where a father or brother may kill her to preserve family honor. In countries like Tunisia or Lebanon, less extreme enforcement can still involve disowning the girl or cutting all ties. But in regions under strict regimes such as Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, punishments can be unimaginably cruel. Women accused of sexual misconduct may be buried to the waist and stoned to death by the whole village, with the first stone thrown by the father or brother, demonstrating that fear, control, and extreme punishment are not just history but active forces shaping lives even today. These examples set the stage for a broader look at how religions across cultures share patterns of control, enforcement, and gendered rules, revealing surprising similarities that extend from ancient foundations to modern society. Across Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, a striking pattern emerges. Sexual control is not just about morality, but about maintaining social hierarchy, power, and obedience. Modesty codes, marriage rules, and prohibitions against extramarital sex serve as mechanisms to monitor and regulate behavior. While the specific laws and punishments differ, the underlying principle is the same. Sexuality must be controlled to protect lineage, family honor, and communal stability. In Christianity, modesty and chastity are enforced through teachings, social pressure, and rituals like confirmation or purity pledges. In ultra-Orthodox Judaism, strict dress codes, gender segregation, and ritual purity laws monitor women's behavior and limit interactions with men, creating an environment of constant self-surveillance. In Islam, modesty rules such as the hijab, gender segregation, and legal consequences for adultery combine to regulate sexuality both publicly and privately. Across all three, the control is gendered. Women bear the brunt of enforcement, while men often enjoy more leniency, demonstrating that these rules are as much about power and hierarchy as morality or spirituality. Interestingly, these patterns extend beyond legal or religious texts into cultural norms, family expectations, and community enforcement. Fear, shame, and social pressure ensure compliance without the need for constant policing. Whether it is public shaming in medieval Europe, honor-based punishments in contemporary Islamic contexts, or subtle social censure in modern Christian communities, the goal is consistent. Regulate desire to protect authority, lineage, and order. By now, the pattern is clear. Across time, place, and culture, religions have treated sex not as a natural part of human life, but as something to fear, regulate, and punish. From ancient laws to modern enforcement, from psychological conditioning to extreme punishments, the goal has rarely been about morality alone. It has always been about control, hierarchy, and obedience. Understanding this allows us to see beyond the surface of doctrine and rituals, revealing the human and social mechanisms that shaped them. The fear of sex is not really about sex at all. It is a reflection of authority seeking to preserve itself, a tool to manage behavior and a means to enforce conformity. By the end, you should see that what religions often present as divine moral law is deeply intertwined with social power, cultural norms, and historical precedent. When we recognize this, it changes the way we think about morality, desire, and freedom. If you found this exploration revealing, consider reflecting on how these patterns may still influence your own perceptions. Share your thoughts, experiences, or questions in the comments. Your perspective matters, and discussing it helps unpack these truths even further. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to continue uncovering the hidden dynamics behind religion, society, and human behavior.